welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Christopher Cox. Chris is a senior scholar in residence at the University of California, Irvine, a Life Trustee of the University of Southern California, chair of the Rhodes Scholarship Selection Committee for Southern California and the Pacific, and a member of several nonprofit and for-profit boards. Between 2 decades as a practicing lawyer, he served as chair of the Homeland Security Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives, chair of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and senior associate counsel to the president. He's written for numerous outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, and he is the author of the most recent book, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. That's the book we talk about. We start by talking about the complicated history and legacy of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is a very interesting person. He's known for a lot of wonderful policy domestically, keeping us out of World War I. But there's also a dark side to Wilson, namely his racist and sexist ideas, even for the time. We talk about the women's suffrage movement, kind of the landscape of that. We talk about some of the origins of Wilson's racist and sexist ideas. We talk about how his evolution as he went through school, as he went through serving in various positions, how he ignored women's rights. He did this as governor. He won the presidency in 1912 and mostly dodged women's rights, even though it was very much of the time. When he becomes president, we talk a little bit about his removal of African Americans from the Civil Service Division. We talk about his interactions with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is what most of the book covers, is those interactions. How he handled women's rights protests, how he ended up changing his position and supporting the Anthony Amendment, which was for women's right to vote, and what his overall legacy is on women's rights and many other topics. As Chris said in the conversation, he has worked for many years on this book, extensive research. It's really a really wonderful book, which was well-researched, well-written, and on an important side of Wilson and what the kind of honest aspects of this darker side of him that we don't hear much about. And so it's all too important. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So like, subscribe, share with your friends. And of course, there are many conversations I've had that are on similar topics. I have some that I've mentioned here in the conversation where I've talked about Woodrow Wilson before in the podcast. Also plenty on U.S. history of the time and other U.S. presidents. So plenty to pull from in the archives. And now I bring you Christopher Cox. I am here with Christopher Cox. Christopher, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
Happy to join you, and you can call me Chris. It's shorter.
There we go. Perfect. Now, you've written an excellent book, which I'm excited to talk to you about. Is that book is called Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. So we're going to get all into it. Before we do, just kind of give folks your sort of potted biography, the most relevant details about you. You have quite a CV before this book. So yeah, tell us what you've done and how you came to write the book.
Well, yeah, so I had a career as a practicing lawyer after graduating from Harvard Law School and Harvard Business School. Got interested, even in law school, in women's suffrage and why it took so long for women to get the vote. My very first article for the Harvard Law Review was about a 1971 Supreme Court case that was the first to hold that the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause applied to discrimination against women. And ever since then, that's been something that I have researched and followed and finally written this book about. My law practice then, after becoming a partner in a commercial law firm, international law firm. I went to Washington as a lawyer in the White House for President Reagan. And after that, I ran for Congress from California, served in Congress for 17 years, was elected to the leadership in the House, the fifth ranking leader, chaired the Homeland Security Committee after 9/11, and then chaired the Securities and Exchange Commission for 4 years, then went back to law practice for a dozen years, and have subsequently joined some nonprofit and for-profit boards. And after I retired from full-time law practice, started researching and writing this book, which has taken me 14 years.
Wow, 14 years. My goodness. Wow.
A presidential biography is a heavy lift. And Woodrow Wilson has been written about a great deal. There are actually over 1,000 books in English about him. And so, first of all, if you're going to write another, you ought to have something new to say. And second, because the ground has been so well covered, you better be certain that what you're saying is accurate, because a whole lot of people have been there before you.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, much has been said about Woodrow Wilson. You must know, maybe not personally, or maybe you do, John Milton Cooper Jr. He wrote a big biography on Woodrow Wilson. I guess it's been 15, 20 years now, but he was on the podcast a couple years ago, and we had a great conversation about kind of the highs and lows of Wilson life and presidency. And of course, there's been many books that have been out on Wilson. Wilson's an interesting person for many reasons. I guess the first question I want to ask you here about Wilson is he's known for a lot of really positive things. I mean, he's, we have, you list him in the beginning of the book. Some people know this. He was our 28th president here in the U.S. Progressive income tax, Federal Reserve, Federal Trade Commission, National Park Service, Clayton Antitrust Act, League of Nations, etc. But he had this, he had sort of these ills about him with that were racist even of the day, and then also somewhat sexist and misogynistic as well as his treatment towards women, both on the political stage, maybe even a little bit privately. How do we square this quote unquote progressivism of his time and many things that he did with some of these pretty pernicious social types of elements with Black folk and women? How do we square these in terms of like the overall kind of picture here?
Well, that is really the question that lingers even after 14 years of research, and even after writing a book with 500 pages of text and another 100 plus pages of notes. It's very difficult to compare the apples and oranges of Wilson's successes and of his failures. You mentioned the Cooper biography. There's also the Scott Berg biography, the two most recent ones. And I would suggest for someone who is, approaching Woodrow Wilson for the first time to read one of those even before reading my book, if you don't know the basic story of Woodrow Wilson. Because my book focuses on what I considered to be a lacuna in the standard Wilson story, specifically the enactment of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in Congress and its ratification by the states, which gave women the vote in the 20th century, was one of the most significant things to happen in America in the whole century, let alone during the Wilson administration when it finally did happen at the end of his second term. Gallup took a poll of Americans at the millennium, the year 2000, and asked people, what do you think is the most important thing that happened in the 20th century? And 2/3 chose women getting the vote, ahead of the collapse of the Soviet Union, landing a man on the moon, even World War I. Only World War II finished ahead. And yet, this enormous accomplishment for democracy was really just a footnote in the standard Wilson biographies. Even even the Cooper and Berg biographies don't make that the centerpiece of what they describe about Woodrow Wilson. And, there's plenty more to talk about. As you mentioned, the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Federal Reserve, the income tax. He led the nation into World War I, midwifed the League of Nations. And so all of those things have predominated, but and those all, certainly from a progressive point of view, stand to Wilson's credit. The racism, which I should say both Berg and Cooper treat, is not central to the Wilson story, but it was central to the story of his opposition to the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Ultimately, his racism, his segregation, which we saw manifest in the segregation of the federal workforce, was explanatory of his opposition to a federal constitutional amendment that would require all states to give women the right to vote, not just those that had chosen to do so. And that would have meant that Jim Crow in the South would have been threatened because federal enforcement would come with that Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So it ultimately tied those two things, race and sex discrimination, together. And those are the black marks on Woodrow Wilson's escutcheon. So how do you weigh that against something like giving us the first progressive income tax? I think the longer lens of history says that these things weigh heavily, that they're very important, and standing athwart progress in those areas, in civil rights and in voting rights, was not to mention civil rights. That's also a part of this book, because the people who protested for women's suffrage and who protested against the war, against World War I, all saw their civil liberties taken away, in extreme circumstances that are highly illegal. Certainly thought so today. So all of these things, I still wrestle with what does this mean for Wilson, and I don't think it means that he's not still a very consequential president, and he's a consequential president. Not only for what he did in office, but for the time in which he served, because it was such a time of ferment in global politics and geopolitics. We had the Bolshevik Revolution that was contemporaneous with the settlement of World War I, and all of this set the stage. The Versailles Peace Treaty set the stage for the modern Middle East. World War I, begat World War II. So, it's very obvious that Woodrow Wilson will still be one of the most significant presidents, and his time will be one of the most significant presidencies, no matter what we think of his unfortunate views on race and on what they then called sex and we now call gender.
Yeah, it is hard to square. It's interesting because, he did do a lot of wonderful things. One of the things, I think it might have been in the Cooper biography, I can't remember, but I was kind of astounded. I still think he is the only U.S. president that has a PhD. And he wrote an incredible book called, Congressional Government. So he has this very, Wilson to me has this very, professorial kind of approach to a lot of things. He's obviously very intelligent, decent administrator. I mean, he was the president of Princeton, things like that. But it's interesting how he has really kind of, as you said, he's kind of these black marks on his record, which really do stand out. Interestingly, as you were talking about some of the polling that was done, women's right to vote is up there. It's just very high up there. When C-SPAN does these kind of national polls or whatever, or these presidential polls, Wilson still lingers, inside or just outside the top 10 of U.S. presidents, which is pretty remarkable considering, some of these challenges he's had with, women's suffrage movement, et cetera. I think he's 13 at the moment. Let's see how that looks after they do it again after Biden's finished. But it's very interesting how he still hangs around kind of that like bottom top 10 sphere, whatever stock you want to put in polling of presidential popularity. But still, it is interesting how he still maintains some high esteem even within how people view presidents. It's just very fascinating.
Yes, and it was relatively recently that the president of Princeton University explained Princeton's decision to take Wilson's name off of their School of Public and International Affairs. And he said in his statement that it was perhaps the case that they had honored Wilson all these years in ignorance of his racism, and the fact that so recently Princeton University itself could claim ignorance of Wilson's racism, suggests that in the popular consciousness, there's got to be a lot more public education about what really went on in those years, because it really was, even for its time, extraordinary. Wilson's racism set him apart from many other Democrats and Republicans of his day, and many of his friends in politics, and many to his left, were encouraging him to support the Susan B. Anthony Amendment and to not segregate the federal government, and he resisted that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it is interesting getting more kind of education on some of the history that we is lesser known is important, because then it starts to reshape kind of ideas or narratives we have. And again, that's not to dismiss any of the accomplishments he had as well, but it just makes it a more complicated picture.
Well, I mean, really, this isn't about Wilson. It's about our country. When people talk about systemic racism, when people talk about how it feels to be a black person in America, and you don't understand if you're not, one of the things that we should be hearing is, we lived through these times. This was real stuff. This is the reason that we are where we are today, because we were held back by these policies that were very explicit, denying us the right to vote, denying us the right to participate in politics generally, denying us opportunities throughout the government and private sector and employment and so on. So there are very real consequences to what went on in the 20th century, and it's less about Woodrow Wilson's reputation than it is about understanding how we got to where we are.
Certainly. Well, yeah, kind of with that, I mean, kind of just give us the sort of landscape of kind of, more specifically, I mean, abolition movements occurred pre-Civil War, but a lot of people, they look at 1920, the amendment, women's right to vote, but the suffragette movement was ongoing for decades. I mean, some people don't realize that. It wasn't, it just started a couple years before 1920. I mean, this was a long-term movement. And so maybe kind of just give us the context, maybe just kind of pre-Civil War and then kind of throughout, what women's rights movements were doing in the middle of 19th century up until kind of 1920. What was that kind of general context?
Yeah, so it's a really important point that you make. Woodrow Wilson, shows up for the final act of the women's suffrage movement, but even when he was born, it was already well underway, and you have to look back really to the beginnings of America to see the beginnings of both the abolition movement and the women's suffrage movement, because they really grew in tandem. Women actually voted, early on in colonial times, and in the state of New Jersey after the United States was formed. It was not just by accident. The New Jersey, Princeton is in New Jersey. That's where Woodrow Wilson, spent most of his academic career. It's where he was governor. His own state used to have women voting, and so and a long time before he was born. So it's an old story. And fast forward to the years before the Civil War, and you have people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton that are working simultaneously for abolition and for women's voting rights, lobbying Congress and so on. Then you have their friends in Congress who are introducing constitutional amendments to give women the right to vote. This is going on during Reconstruction, and this is the time when Woodrow Wilson is growing up. So the Susan B. Anthony Amendment itself, it wasn't named that until the 20th century, but in the 19th century, when it was introduced by a California senator who was her good friend, Aaron Sargent, that wording from 1878 is what eventually became part of the Constitution during the final years of the Wilson administration. So a long backstory that needs to be understood and appreciated to realize how long past due this reform was. And it really was helpful to me. As I mentioned, I had been interested in why it took women so long to get the vote ever since I've been in law school. And this explained it. It was because it was all tied up in race, and the white supremacists, and I use that term advisedly, they called themselves that in the Senate, were standing athwart the Susan B. Anthony Amendment because it would bring federal enforcement to the South, and Woodrow Wilson allied with them.
Interesting here. There's this long history of it, really since the beginning of the republic, if you will, with the United States, and it continues on. And as you're rightfully saying, it's the kind of Wilson gets in here the final act. So I guess with that, I mean, he's born just at the right before the Civil War, and he's privy to these conversations as a kid in his household as he's growing up. What was the impact? Can we say some of this was his family's influence, where he was, born and raised, is, kind of some of the, environmental context. But what do you think, maybe it was just temperament? What was it that really contributed to his, pretty ugly views on race and gender? There were plenty of other people born at this time and in these similar places that didn't have these views, or had them less so at the very least. So what do you think was kind of contributing as he was a young person, as he started going off away into various programs for schooling, raw school, and then Johns Hopkins? What do you guess? What was there in the mix? What are the variables that kind of contributed to such very firmly held beliefs on race and gender?
Well, you've asked a very probing question, because understanding how Wilson came to be Wilson with those views does require looking into his background, his upbringing, what the influences were that he absorbed. And that starts with the fact that he was born into a Southern Democratic family. He was a man of the South. That Southern Democratic background was the most profound and enduring influence on his life's work, both as an academic and as a politician. When people think of Woodrow Wilson, they often recall the political cartoons the day that featured Wilson as a schoolmaster. We naturally remember him as president of Princeton University and briefly as governor of New Jersey, another northern state. He was, in that imagery, a man of the Northeast. But Wilson was a Southerner through and through. He was born in Virginia. He soon moved to Georgia, where he lived until he was a teenager. He and his family then moved to South Carolina, and 4 years after that to North Carolina. When he started college, it was in South Carolina at Davidson before he moved north to the College of New Jersey. But even in those years, he returned to his family home in the South for the academic summers. And when he graduated from college, he made a brief but unsuccessful attempt at law school, and that was also in the South at the University of Virginia. And after that, he moved back to Georgia, where he attempted to start a law practice that was not successful. He literally had no paying clients during the year of that attempt, except for his mother. But he did meet his future wife, a woman from Georgia. Eventually, he started graduate school, as you mentioned, at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Mm-hmm. That was just south of the Mason-Dixon line, and even in those days, as a man in his late 20s, he was moving back home with his parents in North Carolina whenever there was an academic break. So not until he got his first paying job when he was 28 years old as a teacher at Bryn Mawr College outside of Philadelphia did he actually move his domicile to the north. I'd say that his upbringing in the South for those first nearly 3 decades influenced him in a number of ways. Most importantly, his years in the South coincided precisely with the Civil War and the years of Reconstruction that followed. His family were very much on the Confederate side. His father was a Presbyterian minister who preached to his segregated congregation that slavery was part of God's plan and that it benefited black men and women and children. Slavery was something everyone should cherish, he said, because it enriched the superior race. So here's the Wilson family being waited upon by enslaved black servants. Wilson was the last American president to grow up with slavery literally in his own household through his 8th year. In the run-up to the Civil War, Wilson's father broke with the Presbyterian Church because it condemned slavery as a sin. He was a leader in the creation of a breakaway Presbyterian church they called the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America. And this new church wholeheartedly embraced slavery. This is, Wilson's environment. When the war came, Wilson's father became a military chaplain with the rank of officer in the Confederate Army and also volunteered in a Confederate home defense unit called the Silver Grays. He turned the church, his church where he preached, into a hospital for Confederate soldiers and built a stockade around the churchyard, which became a POW prison yard for Union soldiers. Many years later, the adult Woodrow Wilson recalled his father commanding his congregants from the pulpit to immediately repair from the services to the ammunition factory to help with the cartridges, because the Confederacy are suffering from a lack of ammunition. And through all of this, Wilson, we know from his writings, from his correspondence and so on, worshipped his father. And while he was president, he devoted an entire speech to saying so. The father's influence on the son was unmistakable from the start. There was a 1912 campaign biography about Woodrow Wilson that said that he was known as a Democrat of stout opinions from the day he first opened his mouth on campus. His partisanship sprang from his disgust with Reconstruction and Republican insistence on giving black men the vote after the war. At the College of New Jersey, more than a decade after the end of the Civil War, Wilson was arguing with his Northern classmates about the righteousness of the Southern cause, and he often got quite angry about it. After he graduated from college and he was once again living in the South, he wrote an article that he submitted to the New York Evening Post. It was his attempt to explain to Northerners what was wrong with the Republican Party. Fundamentally, he said the Republicans were defying nature because the Saxon race, as he called it, were determined that the Negro race shall never again rule over them as they had during Reconstruction. And Republicans, as he complained in this article, refused to recognize this. He castigated Republicans for promoting ignorant suffrage. And one of his memorable lines in this piece, it's really kind of shocking, borrowed from a fire-breathing white supremacist of the day. He said, Republicans have declared to the world that there's no difference between an American freeman and an American slave, which may not be unmade by a mere act of Congress. We could say, well, that's where he grew up and he was, influenced by his surroundings, but then, he matured and he grew out of that. But that's not what happened, because during his academic years, he published books and he was writing history, and he was literally writing the history of what happened in the South when he was growing up during Reconstruction. And so So we have the adult Wilson telling us decades later, essentially how these things influenced him, because that's what he put on the pages of his histories. And, he did not change his views from what they might have been at the time. He lectured to his students at Johns Hopkins that slavery had done more for the Negro in 250 years than African freedom had done since the building of the pyramids. And on the Princeton faculty, he wrote about Reconstruction in his History of the American People. Really in the same vein, he condemned Republicans for giving black men the vote because it placed an intolerable burden on the white men of the South. All of that, culminates in Wilson's actions when he's elected president of the United States, overloading his cabinet with Southern Democrats who were uncompromising white supremacists, segregating the federal government, and on and on. But I think that's where it comes from.
Yeah, it's remarkable to hearing this, because the thing that you're saying here is this is what I'm thinking is, well, wait a minute. Okay, we can maybe, of the time he's born in the Civil War period, his family, okay, somebody born in this, all these things. But as I stated earlier, he's one of the most, up until that point, probably one of the most formally educated presidents we had or have had. And you would think that after all of that education and after, exposure to different things and reading and researching all these things, maybe there would be a shift. And it almost just seems to ossify even more, which is just more remarkable. I mean, it's really not. There's not a lot of redeemable things here on these issues, which is really a travesty in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it is the one thread that runs through Wilson's entire life. His views about the superiority of Anglo-Saxon white men, or men whom he often referred to as Aryans. He wrote a book called The State, which was a textbook on government that classified all the world's governments according to race and put the Aryans on top. Semitic peoples had to come beneath them; they were inferior, and people like the Turks and the Russians and so on needn't be studied because they were lower on the evolutionary scale.
Yeah, it's just these things sound like such artifacts now, but it's remarkable again in a horrible way of how much this person was not able to kind of shake that, which is kind of difficult. So let's jump here towards some of his time. We've sort of been kind of talking about this, but Wilson had this increasing opposition towards women's rights, suffragette movement during his time at Hopkins in his 20s. But then there's this, I didn't know this part of the story, his experience at Bryn Mawr and his clashes with Carrie Thomas on women's rights was really interesting here. Maybe this sounds like there's a little bit more of a personal component here at his time there. Could you talk about that part of his story with women's rights and the clashes with Thomas and how that kind of maybe further made him more negative towards the rights movement as a whole?
Yes, it's hard to know which came first here, the horse or the cart, whether or not his attitude towards teaching women at Bryn Mawr was born of his preconceived notions and his upbringing and so on, or whether it grew out of that experience. It was probably a little of both. He did not like teaching women, and it's very ironic that that's where he landed. It was the only job that he could get in teaching because even though he had enrolled at Johns Hopkins with a view to getting a PhD, he dropped out after about 18 months and decided he was no longer going to do the required reading and would not, sit for the exams and so on. And so he's got just a bachelor's degree and he's trying to find a teaching job. Took him a long time. And the best that he could come up with was a women's college. His attitude towards women is expressed, and women as political science students or history students is expressed amply in his correspondence with first his fiancée and then wife, Ellen Axon. They corresponded over their 2-year engagement and afterward profusely. So lots of letters, lots of bearing of the soul that we have access to. And both he and she thought it was awful that he was having to be reduced to teaching women. And worst of all, that the dean of Bryn Mawr was his boss, and she was a woman, and she was a woman of his age. So what could be more perverse than that? And he resented having to report to a woman and said so. Their clashes, became known among the student body, who remarked upon it. Wilson would say things like, it's as profitable to attempt to teach women politics as it would be to lecture to stonemasons on the evolution of fashion. And that when he lectured to women, his words would go through a vacuum, things like that. And that was relaxing his mental muscle to teach women. Of course, the women at Bryn Mawr had to pass a ridiculously difficult entrance exam. There was a very high bar that was set from the first at that school, very elite student body, and not surprisingly, many of these women went on to have spectacular careers as academics themselves. So it's not that he had substandard pupils. He just, according to one of the women students who was actually one of his graduate assistants, he just never thought that women had anything of interest to say. And so he would lecture to them, and it was basically, a one-way conversation. He was not interested in what their thoughts might be.
It's kind of which came first here is kind of, I guess, some of the question here, but it doesn't really do anything different for kind of his beliefs. His beliefs were what they were. He does, come out of that, and he does start to make his kind of career, more politically. So kind of out of law, out of academia, okay, and then he has a short time as governor in New Jersey. And he did a lot of great things. Again, election reform, trying to correct corrupt practices, utility regulation, workmen's compensation. But again, still not part of this movement for the women's right to vote. So, and at this point, you say in the book, and it's more of, this was the thing of the day. Like, people were talking about this. This wasn't some fringe movement. This was, on the back pages of the newspaper. I mean, people were talking about this. This was gaining a lot of traction in turn of the century. And I guess just why was he so forward thinking and pushing for all these really, really good things that would have impacted, many people? But he just totally turning a blind eye on this point. Talk about this short time as governor and why he just didn't pick up the women's rights thing there either.
Yeah. So I would say there's a little more nuance to be extracted from looking at the evolution of Wilson's thought on women's rights than on race. He was much more inflexible about race. He liked intelligent women. He just didn't like women who didn't know their proper place. So their proper place being in the household and raising a family and so on. That was partly his religious upbringing. That was one of the things that his father preached about. That the man is the head of the household, and woman's role is different from a man's. In his correspondence with Ellen, he thought that it was a cruel fallacy that women should think they should live a life like a man. Nothing could be further from the truth. So these sorts of views, did affect his thinking. But Ellen, his wife, was easily his intellectual equal, and they had 3 daughters who eventually went to college, to not to places like Bryn Mawr. He wouldn't have wanted that, but to small women's colleges, and two of the three of them rather early on, became suffragists themselves, and his daughter Jessie said, there's four of us, counting mom, and one of you, and yet you have the only vote. So he's hearing these things at home and has to have an impact on him. He also sees how these intelligent women whose conversation he enjoys, really are competent people. And so he has more flexibility there. And that surfaces, towards the very end of his presidency in the second term. I think if you go back to the New Jersey governor time, he was asked by women's groups to support women's suffrage in New Jersey, and he told the press that he was firmly against it because of the effect it would have on the home. So that was his position as governor. Then when he becomes president, and people want him to be for the Anthony Amendment, he says, this is not something for the federal government, it's for the states. So as a governor, he was against it. Now as president, it's none of the federal government's business. So that's the way he started. And to answer your question about how he could be progressive on other things and not on this topic, because those were, in his own words, he said, these are convictions I've held all my life. That's what he told the women who constantly pressed on him at the beginning of his presidency. He said, I've always had these convictions and I'm not going to change.
So it's very interesting how there's again, this resistance. It says something a little bit, I think, about kind of his temperament. So tell us really quick, he becomes 20th president, 1912, serves 8 years, Southern Democrat. There's been books written on this. The 1912 election was pretty interesting. It's a very interesting. It was Taft, Wilson, and Teddy Roosevelt, the Bull Moose Party. And they were all very similar on these sort of progressive, wings of things. You really have to, there's not a lot of daylight between them on many of the main issues. How did, I guess, Wilson, with this kind of element of, not fully supporting kind of the women's rights thing, how did he, avoid or ignore that kind of throughout the presidential campaign, but still ends up winning? He still ends up winning, beating out a very popular Teddy Roosevelt. Taft wasn't maybe as popular, but, he wasn't terrible per se. How did he end up coming through that pretty wild, 1912 election year?
Well, really, the fact that he had two Republican presidents running against him at the same time explains it. The two Republican presidents combined, one of whom, of course, bolted after the Republican convention and started the Bull Moose Party so he could also be in the same election, but he had been a Republican president immediately beforehand. So you've got the two Republican presidents who get a majority of the popular vote. And here's Wilson with 42%, and he becomes president. It was really handed to him on a silver platter. The progressive, as between Taft and Roosevelt, was, of course, TR. And TR was all in for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Taft had declared himself a suffragist in many speeches. He had hosted Susan B. Anthony at the White House and so on. But inexplicably, I think, there's a biography being written about Taft right now by another Simon & Schuster author, Walter
Nice.
Starr, that I think you should very much look forward to. Everybody should.
Yeah.
And I've been talking to him about this. But, why Taft, started out as a suffragist, and his father had been also, and then goes before the National American Women's Suffrage Association while he's president, the first president to address them, and they're all excited because they think now they're going to get some support for the Anthony Amendment from the President of the United States. And he says, I've been thinking about this, and I just don't think it's time. It was a tall glass of cold water. So there he is on that issue. One of the reasons that I think he outsmarted himself on a number of issues, and one of the reasons that he was so unpopular when he was running for re-election. And then you've got TR, who vastly outpolled Taft and is carrying the progressive banner and is for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Wilson was against the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, going head to head with his most popular of the two opponents. And I think that in a head-to-head contest between just the two of them, between TR and Wilson, that Wilson would have lost. But he benefited from the fact that the Republicans were split and had two presidents on the ticket, and that just was a gift.
It's just, that there's certain presidential elections that are kind of interesting. I would put, I think it's 1876, 1800, 1912, 2000. that was an interesting one. There's been some really interesting presidential elections, so this is kind of one of them. So big thing here, he enters the White House. And his administration, kind of back to with sort of civil rights, he removes. There were 23,000, black men and women in the federal workforce, and he removes most of them. And a big example here is from the Civil Service Commission. I mean, this there can't be any. There can't be a steelman argument for this, right? I mean, how does this go on and people are just okay with it?
Yeah. Well, people weren't okay with it.
Mm-hmm.
He was confronted in the White House by one of his supporters who had gone out on a limb, a very well-known black leader in Boston, publisher of a widely circulated newspaper, Harvard graduate. He was Harvard's first black Phi Beta Kappa key holder. His name was William Monroe Trotter. When Wilson was running for president as governor of New Jersey, Trotter, who was his personal comfort zone in politics was socialism. He was a socialist. So he's to Wilson's left. And he goes in and meets with the governor. He's tired of the Republicans taking the black vote for granted. Yes, they'd been making Taft in particular had his black cabinet, and they're making increasing numbers of black appointments, but nothing like the pace at which he'd like to see things happening. And so he wants some competition. He'd like to get a Democrat involved in civil rights. And so he goes in to talk to Woodrow Wilson to kick the tires. And he's been advised that Wilson has not had helpful policies for black people, had no positions for black people in his administration as governor. So he's skeptical. But he meets with Wilson, and the meeting goes so well that when Trotter leaves, he said, "I felt like I was walking on air." And he decides publicly to support Woodrow Wilson for president and gets other black people to do so. Then Wilson, once elected, segregates the federal workforce, and these people are aghast. And he gets a meeting with the president, comes back in, and says, "We had this conversation. You said you were going to be totally fair to black people, and now we get this." And Wilson justifies segregating the federal workforce because everybody will be better off for it. And Trotter, can't believe what he's hearing. He comes back a year later, and it's even worse. And Wilson tells him that he's offended by Trotter's manner, and he's never welcome in the White House again. So we have that kind of pushback. We also have pushback from liberal people like Oswald Garrison Villard, who were friends of Wilson's, who are telling him he can't do this. Wilson's not listening. Villard also pressed him on the Anthony Amendment, and his takeaway from his conversation with Wilson on that was that Wilson would rather lose than be for the Anthony Amendment. So Wilson was very stubborn on these points.
Yeah, it's again, it's the stubbornness, is this kind of prevailing theme here. One of the other big things in his administration, which you highlight in the book, first and second term, but in the first term, is they're kind of a big character or theme in the book is the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NAWSA. How did they interact with him in the first term? And they start trying to get him to even mention the Anthony Amendment. What was the kind of interaction here? Did he just kind of ignored them and just said, "Okay, I'm not going to do anything," or he was sort of pressed on numerous occasions. What was the kind of dynamic there?
Yeah, and that's really the heart of the book is telling this story, which begins on the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration for his first term as president. There's an inaugural parade, of course, as is customary.
Mm-hmm.
But the National American Women's Suffrage Association has a couple hotspurs working for it. One named Alice Paul and another Lucy Burns, and they're young. They're highly educated, both in the U.S. and in Europe, and experienced in British suffragism, which was more radical. So they didn't like the violent parts of the British suffrage movement. Alice Paul herself was a Quaker and a pacifist, but they did like the fact that in Britain they were saying "giddy up" and let's get going on this, and so they wanted things to move a little more quickly, and they wanted to imitate some of what the Pankhurst sisters, who were the most well-known leaders of the movement in Britain, had done so successfully over there, and that's these big, splashy pageants. So they wanted to have a big parade the day before Wilson's inauguration on the same route, using all the same bleachers that had already been set up and so on. And they were going to have thousands of marchers and women on horseback and beautiful floats and displays and so on. It would all be very beautiful to look at. And this actually took place. It took place the day before as Wilson's coming into the train station at Union Station in Washington, D.C. Nobody's there to greet him because they're all out on the parade route. Hundreds of thousands of people looking at the marchers. And then something horrible happens that makes big headlines the following day. And that is that a whole bunch of drunk men and boys, attack the marchers and rather viciously, and they become a big mob. And the D.C. police do nothing about it. And some of them, according to a subsequent congressional investigation, actually were facilitating the attacks and so on. So the women are being badly mistreated. Big black eye for Washington, D.C., big black eye for civility and so on. And so the very first day of Wilson's time in Washington as president, on his inauguration day, we have a headline that he has to share about all of this going on with the women's suffrage parade. That then sets the stage for meetings that he has to take with Alice Paul, because she's been a witness before the congressional hearings and so on. Can't turn these meetings down. They come in and meet with him and say, "We need you to mention the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in your address to Congress." And then he takes about a dozen meetings during the course of the year, telling them all the same thing: no, 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 and never mentions it. Does so the following year and so on. The slow pace of change causes Lucy Burns and Alice Paul to split with NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, form their own group, and now we have competition. So you asked about how Wilson got along with NAWSA. NAWSA turns out to be the good cop over the next several years, and what started out as the Congressional Union and then became the National Woman's Party under Alice Paul, is the tough cop. And they're criticizing Wilson directly. NAWSA is constantly cajoling. NAWSA and the National Woman's Party compete with each other. They don't like each other. They criticize each other. Particularly NAWSA is criticizing the NWP. The National Women's Party is mostly taking it on the chin, and they just keep on keeping on. But the competition, even though they didn't mean to help each other, was very constructive because the good cop, bad cop routine, often works. And so it drove Wilson into the arms of NAWSA, and they could tease a little bit more out of him, and they were very patient. And then the National Women's Party could whack him, between the eyes, and they literally went out to the western states where women could vote and said, vote against all Democrats because Wilson's the leader of the Democratic Party and he's against the Anthony Amendment. And all of the committee chairs in the Democratic House and the Democratic Senate are opposing the Anthony Amendment, and the leadership's all opposing it. They've taken party positions against it. So vote against all Democrats. And that, had some, real political influence. And altogether, it caused Wilson to have to pay attention. It didn't move him very fast, but he was always paying attention. And ultimately, when politics forced his hand, he decided to jump in front of that parade.
What's interesting is this is, as you so wonderfully document throughout the book, this is just a back and forth thing throughout his presidency, and it's really the second term where things start to kind of pick up some pace. Maybe he wasn't going to run again, or some other reasons, but there were two things leading up to his change of position. I guess one big one, but when I was reading this part of the book, I was astounded. There were, women protesters. I think this is 1917 or 1918. I can't quite recall. That were arrested. He literally had women protesters arrested for protesting many of the things that were going on and many of the claims they were trying to make for the Anthony Amendment and other things with women's rights. I mean, I couldn't. I mean, it wouldn't be the craziest thing to happen today, but that would be pretty wild in today's age if we were, arresting female peaceful protesters. I mean, how did that get to that point where he's like, we're gonna kind of bring down the iron fist here on this and make some arrest? I mean, that's incredible to me.
Yes, and the stark change in Woodrow Wilson's approach to peaceful protest occurred once he decided to enter the war. He decided he was not going to brook any opposition. He told the Congress that any disloyal Americans, and disloyalty meant, opposing the war, would face the stern hand of firm repression. And this is a man who chose his words very carefully. And so promising repression to those who were considered by the government to be disloyal, turned out to be a very accurate prediction of what followed. He was, first and foremost, very rough on the peace protesters who came to Washington. So remember, he was the peace candidate. He actually got elected in 1916 because he ran on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." The advertisements for his campaign were quite lurid and depicted Hughes as a warmonger, even though Charles Evans Hughes, his opponent, former Supreme Court Justice and former governor of New York, he depicted him as a warmonger, even though Hughes had not said that he recommended the United States enter the European War. Nonetheless, the ad said things like, if you want war, vote for Hughes. Or one of the campaign mailers for Wilson said, do you want your son to go to hell? If not, vote for Wilson. It was a very stark wedge or sharp wedge that that the campaign was trying to drive between the policies of the two men. And so Wilson is identifiably the peace candidate, and he wins election by all accounts for that reason. California put him over the top. He had lost California even in the three-way race. He had lost in 1912, running against Roosevelt and Taft, because Taft was deprived of access to the ballot in California. Women had the vote there. Roosevelt was the progressive in favor of the Anthony Amendment, and head-to-head, he beat Wilson. So people expected in 1916 that with the 2-to-1 registration advantage that Republicans enjoyed over Democrats in California, that Wilson was going to lose out there in California. He won California, and hence the presidency. Whichever way California had gone, it came down to that state. Either Hughes or Wilson would have won. Wilson won by 3,421 votes, and it was because of the peace issue. The peace issue tore enough Republican women and men away that he got the win there. So he's the peace candidate. And just weeks after he's sworn into office, he asked Congress to declare war. So all of the people who were, confirmed pacifists who had supported him for that reason are up in arms, and many of them come to Washington. They want to protest. And Wilson, who takes over the D.C. government by dint of becoming president, appoints very close friends of his to run the three-man commission that governs the District of Columbia and hires the police superintendent and runs the jails and controls the prosecuting attorneys and so on. He's got all of this machinery in his own hands, and he bans all demonstrations of all kinds and jails people who speak out against the draft that he had to impose and who speak out against the war. And some of those people, famously stayed in prison, like Eugene V. Debs, throughout the entirety of the conflict. And he refused to pardon them. He refused to pardon Debs even afterward. So that's how it started. And once, he's wielding this firm hand of stern repression against the war protesters, the women got the same treatment. And then what the women were doing was, not just, speaking against the war or the draft, which, these days we would consider First Amendment protected. They were doing less than that. They were quoting Wilson's own speeches. That's what they were putting up in the main on their signs, and that's what they were getting arrested for. They were silent. They would call themselves the Silent Sentinels. They stood against the White House fence, which was 40 feet wide. They weren't blocking anybody. And they got arrested on trumped-up charges of obstructing traffic. And what then happened to them in prison was even worse. They were very badly mistreated in prison, brutalized, beaten up, subjected to all manner of what, it's probably possible to call torture, but horribly inhuman conditions that were different from what other inmates were facing, and deliberately so. They were illegally deprived of access to their counsel. Alice Paul herself got a 7-month sentence for, holding up a sign as a silent sentinel herself. And during her 7 months, they put her in the psychiatric ward and force-fed her when she went on a hunger strike, even though at that time that was a life-threatening procedure. So these are the punishments for the trumped-up cause of, or crime of, misdemeanor, by the way, of sidewalk obstruction. The courts eventually got around to this and said that the arrests and the treatment and so on were all illegal, but it came very late.
Yeah, it's reading this part, and it just doesn't make you feel great about some of the things that happened in this part of our history. It's one of these things you don't read. You don't learn about that in high school history class. So it's interesting to read some of these components of history that kind of get untold. So I guess the big piece here, which people may remember, maybe some may know, but the whole book kind of leads up to this, and so I'm curious what your thoughts are here on sort of the elements. Is he changes his position and he does support the Anthony Amendment? Do you feel this would have passed the House even if he didn't vocally support the amendment? Why did he change his position and kind of publicly support it after having literally his entire political life, at least, and personal life, resisting lots of things for women's rights? What was the kind of incentives for him, I guess, to, again, this is his second term, towards the end of it, I guess, back half. What was the motivation for him to kind of change course here?
He changed his position literally the night before 2/3 of the House of Representatives voted in favor of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. A constitutional amendment, of course, takes 2/3.
Right.
And 2/3 of the House don't vote for things that are unpopular. So by the time it had gotten to this point, the fact that on the eve of the vote he was still not on board was of great concern to Democrats in Congress. The Democrats who were working for the Anthony Amendment. Southern Democrats, of course, were largely opposed to it, but there were many Northern Democrats opposed as well because it had been a party position. And so it was hard work for the suffragists in the Democratic Party who were so anxious to get this across the finish line. And they were worried because Wilson had, consistently made statements against the Anthony Amendment that the leader of their party was going to, give them a black eye in this debate. So they attempted desperately to get a meeting with him. He paid no attention until literally the last moment when his White House chief of staff, called secretary at the time, Joseph Tumulty, who himself was a suffragist, put these messages in front of Wilson saying, if you're going to do something, you got to do it now. You got to do it now. And so he met with these Democratic congressmen who came to see him. They were all in support of the amendment, and they were all Democrats. And they met with him for an hour. According to one of the Democrats who was unable to make this public, but we know it from the historical record, Wilson said he was always for states' rights. He hadn't changed, but the situation had changed now, and he decided that he would get on board with it. He allowed them to write 2 sentences that he dictated, that they had asked him for his opinion, and that he said that he thought that this was a good idea. And that's all he allowed them to put out. The Democratic National Committee wanted to put out a press release that described, in more detail why this would be a good idea and what was discussed and so on. And he said he absolutely refused to be quoted on it. So literally, he had actually not said anything. He just authorized these congressmen to put out this little snippet. And that was his flip. That's when he changed. Months later, when the Senate was considering this, it was the same thing, a very last-minute decision on a Sunday to go before the Senate the next day and make an address. And those were his first words out of his own mouth in favor of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and he recommended it as a war measure. And that was because his son-in-law, McAdoo, who was the Treasury Secretary, had really pressed him that, if it lost, he'd be blamed for being AWOL, and if it won, he could take credit, and either way, being on the right side of that issue would set up the next election better. Those were his arguments. Wilson decided he needed to do something, and it was so last minute, a letter or, something to the newspapers and so on wouldn't be enough. So he went to the Senate and he spoke. And that's the very first time he did it. It was not enough to find any senator. No senator changed his vote on account of the speech. Wilson just hadn't done the spade work. He hadn't put any presidential prestige into it, hadn't met with people, hadn't done what he showed he was capable of doing on other issues, horse trading, this for that, and so on. It just wasn't a priority for him.
Yeah, he's giving the most, tepid of endorsements you possibly could. Essentially, it's not, kind of the last hour and nothing's, big proclamations, so it's,
I will say, we have to say that the speech itself, within its four corners, was a very eloquent, pitch for women's suffrage, but, far too little too late. And as I say, didn't move any votes.
Yeah. So I guess the final question I have here for you is, what can we say accurately and fairly and with whatever, credit where it's due or criticism where it's needed, what's the legacy of Wilson's work, definitely as president and then just generally on women's rights? How can we, honestly, kind of critique some of his obvious, poor marks, but then look at, some of the other positive things he did. What's the balanced approach here in looking at him on women's rights?
Well, up until the time that I dove into this research, I was convinced that Woodrow Wilson's story on women's suffrage was one of, begrudging conversion. Whether or not his heart was even in it at the end, who knows? But one way or another, he was a politician and he ended up on the right side. The research led me to a slightly different conclusion. Even after that speech we just discussed that he gave in the Senate, which was really the final act as far as most of the people who have examined this in the past were concerned, he got involved again. And this time, after he was publicly on record in favor of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, he agreed to a Southern Democratic, and these are Southern Democratic senators, plan to rewrite the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which had been unchanged since 1878, and to change the hated Section 2, hated in the South because it was word for word the same as the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing black men the right to vote, which they hated, and change it to say that the federal government is not going to be the enforcer. We're not going to have federal enforcement in the South for voting rights. Instead, states are going to primarily be responsible for enforcing this, and that way they can keep Jim Crow. Wilson blessed it, and the Democrats, after losing control of Congress in 1918, during the lame duck session, tried desperately to push it through so they could say they got the Anthony Amendment done while the Democrats were in charge. But it was this adulterated Anthony Amendment blessed by Woodrow Wilson. So I think that's a very serious blemish on his record of being for, if you will, human rights, for voting rights for people, whomever they are. He didn't want voting rights for black women. He didn't want voting rights for black men, at least not in the South. And hence, he didn't want the Susan B. Anthony Amendment to have federal enforcement. That, to me, is the final point in assessing Wilson's record on this, and it's you have to mark him down for that. So I think that even less than reluctantly coming around and maybe not having his heart in it, but winding up on the right side, I don't even think he wound up entirely on the right side.
Yeah, it's again, I think one of the great things about your book is that it's exposing people to a part of the story most people don't know, and B, it's not a, let's tear him down, he's terrible, but it's more of a careful analysis of, history and some of the data to say, look, it shows like, yeah, he deserves, the criticism on this. And I think a lot of the times historical works or biographies or things like that are just kind of a puff piece, like, look how great he was, which, again, that's, as we said in the beginning, he did some good stuff. Like, it's not that he, but on this issue, it does seem like he missed the mark on it a good majority of the time, if not completely. So it's a helpful reminder for people that we're flawed and complicated, and we gotta critique people so we don't do the same things in the future.
Well, the fun thing about writing this book and about doing the research was that for every disappointment that I discovered in Woodrow Wilson's handling of these issues, there was an offsetting enthusiasm for the wonderful work that men were doing in Congress. I would say men and one woman, because Jeanette Rankin got elected in the middle of this fight as a Republican from Montana. And she was a very effective leader for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in Congress, as were several of the congressmen and senators. And so they, along with some very significant and brave and courageous men and women on the outside, got this thing across the finish line. And I've tried to, show their characters and describe their role in this in the book, because they're the real heroes. And so there's some real happiness to be inferred from this as well. Also, I'll just add that this is a major achievement for Congress. This is not something where the president, made Congress bend to his will. It was the other way around. Congress got Wilson to come along. So we beat up on Congress a lot, and for good reason. And even in this story, the men who were arguing that we shouldn't have the Susan B. Anthony Amendment because the inferior black race is going to be voting, and then so there's a lot of evil thoughts like that, being expressed in Congress. So the institution, takes a lot of heat because there's always people in there that aren't saying what they should be or what you would like. But net, the leadership that Congress provided on this and that built up over so many decades, really all the way from Reconstruction until 1920, it's so impressive that Congress, the institution, won this one and deserves some credit for it. So it's a good story about Congress. We don't get very many of those.
Yeah, no, that's a great point that you make there, is that we do get the other side of how people kept being persistent. Yes, the aspects of Congress as well. So there are some obviously bright lights in the story. Chris, this was so much fun. I really, really enjoyed your book. You explain it very well. It's well researched, well written, obviously. And I just can't say enough thanks for you coming on and talking all about it.
Well, it's really fun, of course, for me to talk about my favorite subject these days. And you are very erudite, and to be complimented for not only diving deeply into this, but all the other subjects that I've observed that you've tackled. So thanks for having me on, and I enjoyed our conversation.
It's very kind of you to say. Appreciate that, and big thanks.
Okay, bye now.